Across Africa today, a deeper conversation about decolonization is unfolding, one that goes beyond politics into memory, identity, and who gets to define Africa's story. Some countries have moved to scrap colonial names in their public spaces. Others are on a campaign to bring back stolen cultural artifacts stashed away in Western museums. But these shifts go beyond mere objects and signposts. They speak to how Africans see themselves, their history, and their place in the world. So this week on the program, we ask, to what extent are these initiatives reshaping Africa's consciousness in a globalized world? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And to explore how Africa is reclaiming its past and redefining its identity today, I'm now joined by our panel of experts. Joining us from Banjul in the Gambia, Hassoum Cissé, Director General, National Center for the Arts and Culture of the Gambia. In Johannesburg, South Africa, Molemo Moiloa, artist and lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand. And from Dubai via Zoom, Professor Zainab El Bernoussi, Professor of Political Science at Global Studies University, United Arab Emirates. A warm welcome to you all and thank you all for joining in this discussion. I want to start off by getting an idea of what identity, African identity, means to all of you. Let me start off with you, Molemo. Africa is made up of many countries, cultures and languages, yet we still speak about African identity. In the 21st century, what does African identity actually mean to you today?
I mean, I think that African identity is very related to a kind of global mirror, in the sense that Africa has been formed in many ways by how it's been addressed by the world, how it's seen by the world. And I think for many Africans, an African identity is about resisting many of the stereotypes and limited frameworks that have been placed upon us without our control. So I think a lot of African identity is about reclamation, is about kind of reframing our heritage, about pushing against racial narratives, but also about sort of presenting ourselves as agent of people in the world.
Director Cissé, what's your thought on that?
The key things that shape African identity, I think, are geographical. You know, we have to realize that Africa has a specific geographical identity. You know, and you have to look at the map, you know, to realize that. And it is important that recently there was a lot of effort by the, African Union, you know, for, you know, the map makers, you know, to reflect the true African identity, on the globe. Now, of course, when you talk about African identity also, you know, there is, language, okay? It's very, very important to the African because maybe the African is one of the few, people who are naturally, bilingual, sometimes even multilingual. So language is really an African identity. And of course, there's this very important aspect of religion. Mm-hmm. Africans are highly, highly religious. You know, they are believers. It can be, believe in any religion, but faith, is a very, very strong African identity. Well, of course, I don't have to mention, the costumes, the music, that Africa is exporting to the world, the cuisine, that Africa is sharing with the rest of the world. So it's a combination. And of course, we have to remember African identity as regards, the tangible heritage also, objects, the bronze, statues, the clay figurines, that also form part of the African identity.
Professor Bernoussi?
Yes, it's an important question. So I have a bit of a maybe different view, in the sense that I think African identity is a problem in being a cognitive dissonance between aspirations and harsh realities. So to me, particularly thinking about how there are impediments often to holding an African identity. So I think, for instance, my passport, right? So limits on mobility, limits on rights, legal resources. I mean, when I think about it, I think that this should be also part of how we can build a project of African identity, in the sense of seeing how it could be also a project of more justice to a continent that has suffered a lot, and that also seems to be still slow in its recovery.
Malemo, let me come to you. Does the average citizen on the streets of Johannesburg, Lagos, Nairobi or Cairo feel a strong shade of African identity that transcends their national or ethnic identity?
In a context like South Africa, where I'm from, we of course struggle immensely with a tendency towards xenophobia and a kind of constant internal conflict between a kind of certain sense of pride in being South African, being Black, for example, but a kind of questioned identity related to the African continent. I think that that identity is often really questioned or kind of put on shaky ground when it comes to relating with the rest of the world, when it comes to connections between us, particularly within the cultural field, things like music, which cross these boundaries and these limitations quite substantially. And I think it's not necessarily about unity per se. I think that the thing that should really be driven forward is a sense of solidarity. And I think solidarity is much more about what we're trying to achieve in the world, and a recognition of the kind of value that we can provide to each other, even within diversity.
And Molemo, do explore those limitations for us a little bit more, because it does go back to our colonial heritage, though. How has Africa's colonial history shaped and, in some cases, distorted how Africans see themselves today?
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly a distortion on the individual level. I think in many parts of the African continent, there have been great thinkers and activists who sort of driven for a kind of pride in being African, being Black, being of the African origin, and trying to address some of the very personal effects of the kind of colonial inheritance. Some of the lasting legacies are also things around, for example, language. We still have significant separations between, say, Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone, and more Arabic-led countries across the African continent. And crossing these boundaries remains a significant difficulty. And where certain kinds of developments, intellectual projects, infrastructural projects might happen in certain parts of the continent, it can be quite difficult to share those knowledges in other parts of the continent because of some of these now quite arcane differences between us. You know? They're not our differences, they're the differences of who we were colonized by. And yet we still really struggle to overcome them, I think.
So, Director, let me come to you here on the issue of Africa reclaiming its heritage, because several African artifacts, particularly, you know, the Benin bronzes, have recently been returned to African countries from the Netherlands, Germany. The UK has also returned about 130 artifacts to Ghana. Why is the issue of restitution of African artifacts becoming such an important issue across the continent right now?
Because the time is absolutely right. Throughout the world, I mean, people are getting increasingly nationalistic. So I see this movement about restitution as cultural nationalism, or if you like, as heritage nationalism. Africans have come to realize that they have to claim what they own, you know, I mean, and these are the objects, you know, the documents, you know, that are found, you know, in Western museums and archives, because they are part of the African identity. You know, most of these objects, you know, were looted, okay, and they are in completely out of context, because some of these objects had ritual, you know, significance. Some had ceremonial, I mean, significance. You know, for example, a drum, you know, that was seized somewhere in the Gambian colony and taken, you know, to Britain, you know, was like a circumcision, I mean, ceremony drum. So if it is kept inside a storage room in a Western museum, you know, that drum is completely out of context, you know. I mean, and also it is happening now because, you know, I mean, Africans, you know, are building the infrastructure, you know, to house them. It is also happening now because Africans are building capacity museum professionals have been trained. African, governments, are ratifying, the relevant UNESCO conventions, like the 1970 convention.
Right.
African countries, through the ECOWAS, through the African Union, are talking about culture. They are debating, the importance of culture and the creative industries in boosting Africa's economy and building, jobs.
Professor Benusi, what's your thought on that?
So as we hear the term restitution, right, better than restoring, in the sense of doing things differently, right? So instituting something new that does not reproduce power imbalances that were sort of part of even how sometimes heritage has been celebrated, right? So if, for instance, you think about the sort of overwhelming space given to kings and queens, right, versus other also very important people of our communities that make up, right, this whole. So I think there should be more thinking about not only just reverting, but really producing new approaches to thinking about culture and heritage.
Right. So, Molemo, let me just come to you with this issue of restitution. How important is restitution of African artifacts across the continent at this particular point?
I think that in many ways, restitution's become a very important subject, in part as a response to some of the other kinds of reparative practice that have failed in Africa. I think in a way there's been a turn to the cultural field as a reaction against the fact that for many of us, sort of nationalized decolonization, governmental, economic, has not been successful in Africa. And so the cultural space and the space of heritage has become a place where Africans are interested to sort of create something new, as the Prof was saying, reconnect with the past, but also create a kind of new way of being. And in many ways, I think the idea of restitution is as much about the return of something from a museum as it is about a remaking in Africa, a connection with knowledges that have been lost, a way of enabling young people to know who they are. There's a lot of sort of knowledge-oriented work around the idea of restitution that is not just about museum objects or artifacts.
Right. So on that note of the idea of restitution being about return of artifacts from a museum, is the returning of artifacts or the renaming of a street or Malemo a meaningful act of decolonization, or is it just a symbolic gesture that is actually distracting from the current socio-economic challenges on the continent?
I think the question of whether restitution is a symbolic gesture is a very important one. And I think it's one that Africans need to consistently ask ourselves and remain really rigorous in engaging with. I think there is a significant threat that restitution can become just symbolic and can be something that really is a beginning of a process that we don't complete, which unfortunately I think is often what happens, is when we try to engage with decolonial practices, we start them and we don't finish them. I think what you're seeing is that across the African continent, particularly with restitution that is driven from community level, so not from as much from governmental or kind of state level. When you see restitutions that come from demands from community, you see a much more extensive engagement around what restitution can be. Sometimes these kinds of cultural recreations are happening in preparation for return, right? Not even with the return having happened yet. And I think these kinds of examples are the examples we need to be looking at of something that goes much further beyond just the symbolic into the knowledge creation, into community systems, into governance models that can be so much more extensive in Africans really determining the kinds of lives that they want to live. And in a way, the idea of restitution of something from a museum in another country is the spark. It's the opportunity for a conversation. It's the way that we mobilize, but it's certainly not the end point.
Right, so let me come to you, Director Cisse. I want to get your response to this return of African artifacts, or the renaming of a street as meaningful act of decolonization. What is your take on this, or do you think it is just a symbolic gesture?
It is more than a symbolic gesture. It is a real movement. I see it as part of the whole movement about reparations, about historical justice, and so on and so forth. But there are so many, issues that, come into play. We have to remember that there are a lot of heritage objects and artifacts in Africa itself that need to be collected, inventorized, and put into storage or on display. Urbanization, is leading to the destruction, of a lot of these heritage objects. So restitution is good, but we should also, remember that it cannot be a distraction from the fact that there are a lot more objects, in Africa to be collected, accession, inventoried, and put on display. Coming back to your question, who took out these objects? Who took them out? Why? How? Like some of these objects were looted, by the conquering colonial powers. That's fine. But some were given away, by our own rulers. The restitution movement is a jolt that we should get up, and do a lot more things, like improve infrastructure to house, our heritage, train more heritage professionals, make the heritage laws strong, robust, and responsive. Yeah.
All right, we are going to take a short break, and we'll continue with this discussion in just a moment. When we return, we will continue with our discussion on decolonizing Africa's identity, the African Union's role, and what the renewed consciousness means for Africa in a globalized world. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Hassoum Cisse, Malema Moiloa, and Zainab El Benoussi. I want to come to you, Malema, because Western museums often cite universal access and conservation concerns as reasons to keep African artifacts, and that African countries do lack the capacity to preserve artifacts. How do you respond?
Well, the idea of the Universal Museum comes from a statement that was made by some of the top museums globally many years ago now, in part in response to restitution claims from people from across the world, not just from Africa. I think at this point that statement is considered kind of old-fashioned, and anybody who attempted it would probably have people laugh at them, because I think we've really moved far beyond that to an understanding of the nature of the need for justice, and that justice is a kind of foregrounded subject at the kind of forefront of the restitution conversation. I think the question of the capacity of Africa to care for these belongings is a complex question. I think on the one hand, there is of course the reality that Africans made these belongings and therefore have the ability to care for them in some sense. The other is that the question of whether these objects should be returned to museums is still an open one. I think it's often assumed that the appropriate place for these cultural forms of value to be returned to in Africa is museums, and that's not always the case. In many circumstances, there are ceremonial, spiritual, kind of communal value for return. And having this in a museum is not necessarily the most ideal situation. And there needs to be more of a articulation from the African continent that part of the decolonization process means we will not simply replicate the museum practice of the North, in the African context.
Yeah.
I think the question then is what are the alternatives? And I think Africans still need to fully solve that question.
But Molema, we do live in a globalized world today. So to what extent then should Africa decolonize in a globalized world that has many universal characteristics? How does an African balance between being an African and a citizen of the world?
I mean, I think this is a kind of global question, is what does it mean to be from where you are from in an increasingly connected, digitalized world? And I think really those are questions for Africans to answer for themselves. And I mean, it's very evident in other parts of the world that kind of cultural grounding is very naturally connected to what it means to be a modern citizen. And the idea that being African heritage, African culture is not synonymous with or able to connect with being a modern global citizen is really, I mean, it's a crazy sort of assertion. I think it's really about bringing what we have as Africans to a global melting pot, a global conversation.
But let me now come to you, Director Cisse, on the whole question of African identity. Is the biggest challenge to African identity external, that is Western museums keeping artifacts, or is it internal, a lack of investment in local languages, in our history, in our heritage, and in our education systems?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two. You have the extraneous factors, and that really has to do with this unfinished business of decolonization, because really this restitution should be seen as unfinished business of decolonization. I mean, decolonization, at first was basically about regaining political, and economic, freedom. But now that the heritage, that belongs to Africa, the identity of Africa, is still found, in the museums and storage rooms of the former colonial powers. Mm-hmm. This shows that decolonization is still an ongoing process. So I think we should see restitution as an unfinished aspect of decolonization. And now on the other part, it's internal. Like the teaching of history in our schools and universities. Of course, in the 60s, we had Ibadan, we had the university in Dakar or Zaria, or in Makerere or in Dar es Salaam with Walter Rodney. There was a movement, to teach, African history, mm-hmm. so that, people will be proud, of the achievements of the ancestors. But over the years, due to structural adjustment programs, right. The teaching of history, like teaching of many other subjects, has really reached sort of a dead end. So that should be revisited. We have to teach history. We have to teach cultural studies. Valorizing our languages. Having language policies. The national languages. To be able to write in them. To use them in our parliaments. To use them. At official functions.
Right.
For example, if a Gambian and a Senegalese, are meeting at official level, why speak in French or English? Why not speak in Mandinka or in Wolof? Or if a Gambian and an official from Guinea-Bissau meet, why not communicate in Fula, or in Mandinka or in right. Wolof? These are things that I think will help us to regain the African identity.
Yeah, so I want to get your winding up comments, and let me start with you, Professor Benussi, quite briefly. If the African Union succeeds in its Agenda 2063 aspirations, what would the average African citizen be experiencing differently in their daily life? An issue that proves a strong cultural identity is real.
I wish for us Africans that by 2063, and I hope that we can achieve as much of the AU's agenda items in terms of development, so political and economic, but I think in terms of also sort of imagining materially what it could look like, to me an really important aspect would be to have an average African citizen with much more rights. So here, in terms of legal rights, not only within one state, but also as recognized around the world. Also a citizen that is free or more secure from high levels of violence that we are seeing in many of our countries, that there is a wider access to its national resources, and also having an average citizen that's seeing its country and its continent being part and a thriving actor in the international community.
Director Cisse, your thoughts?
I think culture and identity are getting increasingly, important, in the African Union, in ECOWAS and other regional organizations. I am just coming from Dakar, Senegal, where I was leading the Gambian delegation at the ECOWAS Cultural Festival, the first edition. And, it's a great event, despite all the political upheavals in the ECOWAS space, we were all there, celebrating culture, in dance, in cuisine, in costumes, in the visual arts. So there is a lot of interest at the national level. New policies, on the creative industries, are coming out, from different African countries. The donors, are coming into support the development of the creative industries. Museums have been established. There are heritage training, schools now in several African universities. ECOWAS is active. The African Union is active. In restitution. In heritage. So I think I'm very, very positive that we are on a trajectory that will ultimately, assist us, to reclaim, the African identity. Because, like I said at the beginning, this is the unfinished business of decolonization. We can only be completely decolonized if the African identity and heritage, is totally in our hands, and then we can share it with the rest of the world.
Molemo, you have the final word.
I think that's a tough question. I think that the realities of the African continent mean that much of the change that happens, much of the growth that happens in Africa comes from the people on the ground, not necessarily from policy, not necessarily from supranational structures. I think it's really about the ways in which Africans and localized formations are able to work in collaboration with the agendas of the AU. I think the kind of broader vision is for a process. It's not necessarily an arrival. And I think one of the things that we should always keep in mind is that restitution is not a finished process, right? So Agenda 2063 is not necessarily for a kind of utopia that we want to arrive at, but to have the capacities, the agendas, the resources that are really driven from Africans to be in the process of making the lives we want to see. I don't think Agenda 2063 is necessarily that endpoint, but there is a lot of need for greater skills, greater resource diversification across people on the African continent, and certainly more collaboration and solidarity amongst Africans to address these kind of wicked questions of our problem and problems of our time.
All right. Thank you all very much for your thoughts today. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Hassoum Cisse, Director General, National Center for Arts and Culture of the Gambia, Molemo Moiloa, artist and lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and Professor Zainab El Bernousi, Professor of Political Science at Global Studies University, United Arab Emirates. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.